Really? And what is the single biggest opportunity for both Southeast Asian businesses and foreign MNCs across ASEAN, and why?
Okay, this is a $2.5 trillion economy for ASEAN. We take a 20-year view. Potentially, we're going to have an accumulation of about $100 trillion worth of economic funding for ASEAN. If we assume that 50% is going to relate to domestic consumption, then there's going to be about $50 trillion worth of economic sizing on a cumulative basis for the next 20 years. So the question is, what would be the single visible opportunity for all of us? I think it's the goods and services that are going to be consumed by all the ASEAN community members. So we just need to make sure that we ramp up the intra-trade, which has been steadily at only 25% of the collective GDP. So it reflects upon our desire and aspiration to trade with partners beyond ASEAN, which is great. But I think, we should not be staying at just the 25% of the GDP in terms of our trade with, or amongst ourselves. So that's, I think, visibly right there in front of us that we need to capitalize upon.
Competition has increased between other regions like China, India and the Middle East. What can national governments and cities in ASEAN do to ensure that the region remains competitive? And what is the role of the private sector in this process?
Well, I think the commonality between India and China could perhaps be education. Yes, some countries in ASEAN are more, if not much more educated than some others in ASEAN. That is, I think, an investment that ASEAN collectively ought to take a view on. And I think the government or the governments of some ASEAN countries have recognized that as an issue to be addressed. But it has to be addressed by way of how much fiscal space they have. They have limited tax collecting capabilities. Some countries run at a tax ratio of 12 to 15% of the GDPs. Developed countries run on a rate of 30% of the GDP in terms of how much they collect on taxes. So I think there's room for upside. Now, once this is taken a view of by the government as to help elevate the quality of the education, then they can start talking about elevating the quality and the quantity of the hard infrastructure, the railroads, the power generation capabilities, the seaports, and all that good stuff. Once this gets rolling, I think that's the moment or the pivot when I think the private sector, be it the domestic players or the non-domestic players, will probably gravitate towards.
Collaboration has been a key theme of this conference. What can governments and the private sector do to ensure consistency in areas like regulation, financial inclusion, human capital development across all ASEAN nations?
Well, collaboration is key amongst ASEAN members. We seem to take it for granted that ASEAN has had peace and stability and also prosperity since the late 60s. And I think this is a unique attribute as to why we may be the least volatile in terms of GDP growth in the last few decades. But I think further on, the private sector needs to be a lot more robust and proactive in terms of talking to each other and be more patient. Yes, we're noticing that perhaps the leadership of some or many governments within ASEAN probably are not as decisive as what we might have seen in the past, but that should not be a factor in terms of diluting the necessary or capacity of the private sector to be proactive and robust. When the gate opens up at the end of this year, I think people will be exposed. The business community will be exposed. But I think we've got to be patient in facing and confronting this reality. Communication needs to be, I think, more advanced, amongst the business community members of ASEAN. So rest assured, we've had that run for decades in terms of peace and stability. We need to make sure that only collaboration and communication amongst the private sector would help sustain, those attributes that we've had in the past.
Moving on to your native Indonesia, what trends have emerged among Indonesia's consumers, particularly the millennials, and where do you see the future of the consumer segment across the vast country?
Well, I think the digital space is where we're seeing a lot more hit, a lot more action taking place. And this is an area that I think is a little bit of a black box for some. And I think it needs to be opened up and unleashed by the operators, the actors, but also by the consumers. I think the consumers will gravitate to anything that's hip. And that's a good chunk of the goods and services that's taking place in Indonesia. Indonesia is known to be a pretty consumptive society. 60% of our population are younger than 39 years old. So that will reflect upon, the degree to which we'll be consuming and at the rate that we're going to stay youthful for a long time. So I think whatever nature of consumption that's new age, that's, the 21st century, I think will characterize the consumption of the society.
How is the Indonesian government capitalizing on this opportunity? I mean, the stats are mind-boggling. 280 mobile subscribers. By 2016, they'll have more than 100 million internet users. Are there any plans in place to develop the country?
I think there's conversations, not just among government officials, but between government officials and non-government people about creating a lot more connectivity. Look, I mean, as I said earlier, not a whole lot of entrepreneurs in Indonesia have access to banking. I think the mobile capability is an area where they could capitalize upon in order to create a lot more connectivity, between the banking institutions and the private citizens, or those that may want to be more entrepreneurial going forward. Talk about the small, medium entrepreneurs. Out of the 55 to 60 million entrepreneurs, only a small chunk of that have bank accounts. So the big chunk of that, I think, could be taking advantage of their handphones for the purpose of connecting themselves with financial institutions.
Finally, does Indonesia see itself as a tech hub or a future tech hub?
Not in the near term, but I think there are aspirations to get there. But in order to get there, I think we've got to get the basic infrastructure sorted out first.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, sir.
All right.